some of the supporters that make this happen for the students. The Alberta Institute for Wildlife Conservation, which is also AIWC, has been a partner for a lot of this work. They have also funded some of these opportunities as well. The Elbow River Watershed Partnership, ERWP, thank you also to them for their collaboration, the funding, student support, and for us to be able to do this work alongside them. And Tsuut'ina Nation Office of Land and Environment Research Department, which has also supported the work that we're going to present on tonight. And of course, the Office of Sustainability, Alana Dawn, thank you so much for all of your work and support in so many different ways throughout the years. And of course, the Faculty of Arts and Dean Aoife McNamara, who has also been extremely supportive and has given me the time to be able to do this type of work. The Taylor Institute for Teaching and Learning, and the Director of Indigenous Studies, International Indigenous Studies, who is Dr. Craig Ginn, for his unequivocal support of the work that I do, that then enables me to help and support the students for the work that they do. And then lastly, to tie this all together, what happens is typically students take various courses. We focus on community-based projects in all kinds of very interesting ways. And if any of you in the audience are interested in supporting students or creating partnerships and in experiential learning in community with animals and the environment, please reach out, because I'd love to chat to see how we can support students who then go on to graduate to work in all kinds of exciting positions for NGOs, in community, go on to grad school, etc. So the last piece that I'd like to say is to thank the funders. So MyTax Canada has supported some of the work that's been done here and the students throughout the summer. The Environment Canada Community Climate Grant, ECCC, which again, the Office of Sustainability has provided for the students. ERWP, Indigenous Summer Student, the program, which is ISSP, they have also provided funds to make this possible. So thank you to all of those partners. Now, in the next slide, what I'd like to address is I'd like to introduce all of our speakers today, and then I'll hand it over to them, and they'll share with you all of the exciting work that they have been pursuing over the last 2 years. So I'll just start with Emily. And if we could go to the next slide for that, thank you. So Emily Tulk is focused on co-learning with beavers. And this was an exciting project. Emily's in her 4th year of undergraduate studies, and she's majoring in zoology at the University of Calgary. She works with wildlife. She works with local farmers. She gave a stellar presentation in class recently on pigs. She also works with companion animals as well. And this summer, Emily worked with me and with the Alberta Institute for Wildlife Conservation, as well as with the Office of Sustainability. But specifically, she worked with the beaver, and she'll tell you all about that. So these experiences have inspired Emily to work toward becoming a veterinarian. She'll also start our session today by sharing some of the work from the summer and the spring and the lessons that she had learned from the beaver. So I'm really excited to hear that talk. And then following Emily's talk, we'll have Sadie Popoff. And so Sadie's she'll be the next presenter. And she's in her 5th year of biology as an undergraduate student at the University of Calgary. And she's interested in conservation and the concept of One Health as well, which is at the intersection of humans, wildlife, and the environment. She's also worked with numerous injured animals throughout the summer and otherwise. And is involved in a wide variety of projects across the university with veterinary medicine and in other projects in her honors work and so on. And her talk will be on resilience and how that relates to conservation, and more broadly, how we can imagine how some of those concepts that she'll be teaching us about and sharing with us and talking to, how that relates to climate change. Next, following Emily's talk, following Sadie's talk will be Jer Bobosky. And you'll see the intersection there or the connection there to water. And then Jer is going to be talking about some of the podcast work that she did this spring and summer. So Jer is Woodland Cree from Little Red River Cree Nation. She also has a very unique skill set working with technology and has helped me so many times in my classes when I have assigned podcasts and other such assignments that involve technology. Also, including that, she's very knowledgeable in gaming, and in a previous life was a highly successful YouTuber. So Jer's a podcast technician. She was that throughout the spring and summer and continues that work now with the Elbow River Watershed Project, so ERWP. And she's working on the 10-year flood anniversary podcast episodes, as well as with Sutuna aquatic habitat restoration podcasts. So she'll tell us all about that, and was connected to ERWP, so with the partner, from some of the work that she's done with me and in political science and throughout the university as a whole. So I'm excited for that talk. And following Jer will be Gabriella Livingston, which I'm really excited that Gabby's able to join us, because Gabby's a recent graduate and has been doing other things after graduation. And so we're really, really fortunate to have her with us as a special additional guest speaker with us tonight. I'm excited for her talk as well, because she had worked with me, not this summer, but the summer previous to that. And so she also worked with the Alberta Institute for Wildlife Conservation, and she focused on baby bird care. And I learned so much about what it takes to care for baby birds. It did sound like more work than I had with my kids. So I'll let Gabby tell you all about that. So she did share some exciting lessons with me, and we'll go on to share that with you tonight. So Gabriella Livingston is, her pronouns are she, her. She's a Red River Métis and a recent graduate from the University of Calgary from the Global Development Studies program. Gabriella has worked with the university as a research assistant and research coach during her undergraduate degree. She's passionate about environmental, political, and social change and the capacity of decolonized research to create spaces that are inclusive of Indigenous perspectives and experiences. She worked with the Alberta Institute for Wildlife Conservation on a 4-month summer research position exploring the impacts of climate change on birds. So you can also find Gabriella's work in the webinar chat. There's a link to a very exciting webpage that she and the team created 2 summers, 1 summer before this summer ago. So I'll pass it over to these very exciting panelists, and so that you can learn from them. So I hand it over to Emily.
Awesome. Thanks so much for the amazing introduction, Adela. I'm really excited to be here and talk to everyone about the importance of the beaver. I just would like to mention, like Adela said earlier, that I worked really closely with the Alberta Institute for Wildlife Conservation on this project, as well as the Office of Sustainability at the University of Calgary. We can head to the next slide. So to start us off, I want to talk a little bit about what the beaver means to us. And for me, in order to discuss the importance of the beaver, I think it's important to first ask ourselves what the North American beaver means to us. I will give everyone a moment to think about if they personally had any encounters with beavers and if you can recall how this has shaped your perspective. I'll just let everybody have a moment to think about that. that was enough time for anybody to think about anything that was floating around in their head. So I'll share for me as a student working at the Alberta Institute for Wildlife Conservation. I worked very closely with an orphaned baby beaver that was in our care, and this laid the foundation for my relationship to the beaver. I've since worked in partnership with the Office of Sustainability at the University of Calgary, looking at the current research in relation to the beaver and their impacts on climate change. And through this work, the beavers have not only earned a place in my heart as friends, but as creators and caretakers as well. I think we can head into the next slide where I'll talk a little bit about the adversity faced by beavers. And while the North American beaver is a native and critical species to Canada, they also face a lot of challenges and adversity. Upon engaging in this community, one of the commonly held misconceptions that was shared with me in a talk by Dr. Jordan Kennedy, an interdisciplinary field researcher, lab experimentalist, and engineer with strong ties to her Blackfeet tribal community, is that many farmers and landowners alike believe that beavers are removing the water and having negative impacts on the ecosystem. Extensive research has shown that in actuality, beaver dams help mitigate floods, store water reserves during drought, and lessen the impacts of wildfires. In working with AWIC, I have received and observed many complaints about the presence of beavers on one's land and requests for removal. After shedding some light on the adversity facing our beaver communities that I believe comes from a place of misunderstanding, I'm very excited to share why I think beavers are so incredible, and you should too. With that, we can head into the next slide where I'll talk a little bit about beavers as teachers. So the concept of animals as teachers may be new to some of us. I know that for myself, I have intuitively learned from animals for the entirety of my life, but through my research and exposure to teachings from Dr. Robin Kimmerer, a scientist and author from Potawatomi Nation, I hold more appreciation for all that the land and its inhabitants have to teach us. In the case of my friend the beaver, much about the state of the ecosystem, production for success, and development of complex damming systems can be learned. Through studying and observing the impacts of the beaver's biological activities in the ecosystem, we have been able to see the extensive positive impacts their dams have in terms of restoring and maintaining their aquatic habitats. Through understanding these processes, we can work toward man-made dams that are hopeful to have similar benefits on the landscape. And while it's hard to replicate what nature offers us as a gift, this is a hopeful starting point for future sustainability. So next we can move into the next slide. I just want to talk a little bit about beavers as providers. It relates really well to a lot of the research I was doing this summer. So beaver dams provide services to the landscape, such as increasing water storage, hyperetic exchange of contaminants and nutrients, and reducing peak discharge. However, one of the most interesting concepts depicted by the image here explains how beaver dams are able to bring a dry, arid landscape back to a thriving and diverse aquatic ecosystem. This is one of my favorite pictures from my research this summer. I think it really shows things well. So rising climate has led to lower stream bed elevation due to increased evaporation that has resulted in disconnection from riverine floodplains and channel incision. Streams with narrow incision trenches are dammed during low flood periods, but the water velocity is too powerful, resulting in blowouts that increase erosion, widening the incision trench and forming floodplains. Widening of the incision trench decreases stream velocity, creating an environment better suited to beaver dams. This results in wider, more stable dams. The high sediment loads from the recently incised streams fills the beaver ponds with sediments, leading to temporary abandonment of the site but establishment of riparian zones due to accumulation of sediments. This process continues until the beaver dams raise the water table enough that multi-threaded channels with high diversity in the riparian zones form. This process of restoration as a benefit of beavers' biological activities links very strongly to this perspective of Dr. Robin Kimmerer. Kimmerer describes that our first responsibility when waking up in the morning should be gratitude, as Mother Earth provides us with all that we need. We are showered in gifts from the earth and should ask ourselves, what does the earth ask of us in return? We've been offered the gift of the beaver to counteract a system of taking without replenishing for too long. Kimmerer suggests that we look at the world as a bowl with one spoon of equal sizes for all. It is our responsibility to keep that bowl full, and the spoon size does not change regardless of intention. If we apply Kimmerer's perspective on the earth being a caregiver and provider, it only makes sense that we should also be conscious of how we say thanks for this and not overuse gifts from other beings that we have not earned. With that, we can head into a little bit on beaver kinship. So before beginning my work with AWIC, kinship between more than human animal relatives like the beaver and humans was a foreign concept to me. However, after working so closely with our resident beaver and learning about the deep interconnectedness of their family units and social structures, I will always admire all that the beaver has taught me in terms of working and caring for one another at all stages of life. From birth to 2 years of age, the North American beaver lives with their parents and helps support the most recently born offspring before establishing their own families. All beaver communities work in tandem with one another to build the dams that re-engineer the ecosystem and warn each other of potential threats. This is why it can be very challenging to care for and support beaver patients, as they require a strong connection to their caretaker, and release back into the wild into an unfamiliar community is assumed to have its challenges. A perspective shared with me while doing this work and explained by Dr. Margaret Robinson, a Mi'kmaq scholar from Lennox Island First Nation, speaks of humans and animals as a continuum rather than us and them as separate beings. This outlook was made even more clear to me after witnessing the compelling relationships established with our beaver in care. As Robinson suggests, understanding these relationships and idea around kinship can potentially enrich the work we are doing and have lasting positive social impacts. My hope is that in sharing this perspective, many of us will feel less inclined to see beavers as pests, but as allies, friends, and family. And then we can head into my last slide here. I just wanted to talk a little bit about our responsibility to our more than human friends. So my survey of the available literature only scrapes the surface of the pervasive effects beavers and hence their biological activities have had on the land. With the ability to restore fragmented landscapes to their former diversity and compact some of the impacts being observed with raising temperature, it is critical that we look into ways of supporting these confounding animals. Future research should consider the feasibility and impact of reintroducing beavers into landscapes where they are absent or at low population. This, of course, would require extensive ethical concerns and consideration of beaver behavior, family structure, preferred habitat, etc., but could be a potential direction forward. So what can you do as someone who's passionate about sustainability? I listed off a couple of things here. My first one is to take initiative in conservation efforts. There's many local wildlife rehabilitation centers like AWIC that are always looking for additional support. To remain conscious that while some of the activities of the animals around us may be disruptive to our day-to-day activities, they are likely contributing in ways we're not fully aware of. And to remember that living alongside our more than human friends and offering them both respect and reciprocity for their contributions is the beginning of moving forward in a good way. So that kind of closes up my presentation. I have some citations on the next slide. For anyone that's interested, my email will also be shared at the end of this, so feel free to reach out to me for any questions. And with that, I'll pass things off to Sadie.
All right. Thank you so much, Emily. I love sharing your story with the beaver. I find myself looking at pictures of him probably an unhealthy amount of time. So I love that we're able to share that with other people here. So today I'll be talking a little bit about the concept of resilience and how that applies in conservation and just wildlife health and how I saw that in my own life. Next slide. Oh, I think there was maybe one before that. Yeah. All right, so before we can really dive into this, I just wanted to ask you guys what resilience means to you. Feel free to type this in the chat. You don't have to if you don't want to. It's up to you. It can be as complex or as simple as you want it to be, just a simple word. And again, you don't have to participate if you don't want to. It's just something to get you thinking about it. So while you're writing your answers or thinking about your answers, I'll go into a little bit about what resilience means to me. So on the next slide is my initial thoughts. So before really starting my research in digging into the literature of what resilience means, I made up this definition of resilience as meaning withstanding or succeeding during or despite challenging and hard times or circumstances. So I associated this concept with terms such as bounce back, cope, willpower, or endure. And then one of the first examples that came to mind of resilience in my own life was in childhood memories of my parents finding a way to make a story, as they always said, even when things weren't going as planned, or working harder to bring like that laughter and light into difficult times, which I think is really important for just fostering individual resilience or individual as a family, or resilience as a family. And then another place I saw it frequently was in my field of study and work. So at the wildlife rehab, all the animals that we were getting in, so the injured, orphaned, or sick wildlife, such as the little beaver, were always coming in, or I was always amazed by their resilience, because often if you can approach and contain a wild animal in the first place, that means they're probably in a pretty dire situation already. And the fact that they're able to survive out in the wild for typically a significant amount of time before they're actually coming into the clinic really amazed me. And then additionally, wildlife rehab is completely different than working in a vet clinic due to the stress of being in captivity for wildlife. And yet with proper treatment and very species specific and individual specific husbandry, they were able to heal and return to the wild, which absolutely amazed me. And I think was a huge reason why I fell in love with this industry and working with wildlife, just seeing that amazing example of resilience that often isn't that evident. And then in wildlife as well, just learning from them. And then the last example is just the resilience that is needed to work in this industry or in any care worker industry. It's a really emotionally, physically exhausting jobs at times. So you really need to be able to figure out ways that you can foster resilience in yourself. And then also having a team that supports that is extremely helpful. So it looks like we have the art of coming back as one of the definitions that was shared in our chat about resilience, which I really love that. That's a good way of putting it. So moving on from that, I looked into the actual definition. So this is just the broad general definition when you search up on Google, what is resilience? So the words that really stood out to me in these definitions was capacity and ability, which caused me to see resilience as more than just a state that you can be in or a state that you have or property, and more of a dynamic process. What I didn't realize is how complex this can actually get. So on the next slide, there's so many different things that come into play when you start talking about resiliency. So on that first slide, there was kind of that initial state, a change happens and it's disturbance, and then there's a return to the initial state as like kind of the depiction of resiliency. But then once you get more into it, there's all these different things of what resiliency could mean. So it could be maintaining stability, or maybe it's transforming to an actual different state that might be more stable in the given circumstances. And then maybe minimizing the time back to recovery. So there's so many different ways that you could define resiliency, and it could mean so many different things to different people. So it's contextual, depends where and who and what you're applying it to. And then it's also dynamic. I think it changes constantly and involves so many different processes that there's so many different factors at play. So then when it comes to ecology, there's three kind of primary definitions that are prominent in the literature. So engineering, ecological, and social ecological. So engineering is defined as, or defines resilience as the speed of recovery and return to the equilibrium state. So that's kind of that first graph with the stable state, the change happens, and then you return back to that same stable state, kind of emphasizing equilibrium and then efficiency, so time to recovery. Then ecological gets a little bit more complicated because it starts to include the relationships and factors involved in that. So it's defined as a system's capacity to maintain the essential relationships and functions, whether through generation or transformation. So that's where you start getting the different transformations or regenerations to different states given new circumstances. So it might not be the initial state that you were in, might not be ideal in the new circumstances. And then social ecological resilience is defined a little bit more of as an extension of ecological, but it contains the actual amount of disturbance a system can take before there is a shift, the system's capacity to learn and adapt, and the degree to which they can self-organize, so how much they can actually adapt to a different state that might be better suited for the environment. And the thing that really stood out to me was also the emphasis in these concepts about the relationships and that interaction there, which really highlights the importance of relationships, and connectivity that is often prevalent in indigenous knowledge as well. And then so in my next slide, I've said resilience so many times, but why is actually important in conservation and sustainability? So first of all, it allows for the development of greater understanding of interactions and relationships important to making and maintaining a healthy ecosystem. And it also looks at multiple different scales. So rather than looking at a specific issue or species, this also means that conservation efforts that aim to enhance resilience could have potential for broader beneficial effects. Secondly, this approach embraces uncertainty and encourages variability. So in today's world, the world is constantly changing. The needs of humans are constantly changing with the growing population. And then also with climate change, there's a lot of challenges that are coming our way. So the way managing for resilience aims to improve response and adaptability to these unpredictable changes and challenges that are coming, or could be coming. And then third, this also provides a potential avenue for proactive monitoring. So actually being able to measure how resilient, say, an individual is in an environment before the actual impacts of low resilience are visible. So for example, seeing declining populations, maybe you could detect the low resilience in that population by looking, there's a whole bunch of things that need to be established before we're able to do this, but by looking at different indicators of resilience before they start declining and before it's a lot harder to actually regenerate. So I'll give two examples now. My first one's just going to be a general overview of what I'm working on for my honors thesis. I'm working on more of the methods, so I'll be talking more of the theory behind it rather than the actual work I'm doing. But this is also an application in wildlife health on the individual level. So it's a little bit more simple before you broaden it up to a bunch of different factors. So you start with this little mouse that some of you might not like having in your house, but then it is subjected to all these different stressors in its environment constantly. So different land uses, loss of habitat, and all these things that are kind of piling up on it and making it harder for it to cope with like an acute stress event. So an event, let's say a human catches in a live threat, that would initiate the stress event, which is important to actually their ability to have that flight or fight response. And if they are dealing with constant chronic stress, that reduces their ability to initiate that fight or flight response that is really critical in their survival. So we're going to be looking at different biological markers of how we can measure resilience in the field or in individual rodents and trying to give like a way for proactive monitoring, I guess, of how a population is doing versus what it looks like they're doing. So they might be very low resilience, but we aren't able to tell because their populations are doing great in size and everything like that. And if you have any questions on that, that's a little bit of a brief overview. So feel free to contact me about that because that's just a general gist of what that is. So then the second example, I think it's really important to highlight Indigenous perspectives on resilience and how this is also very important in conservation efforts to incorporate Indigenous knowledge, because often there's a lack of that, or there's an increasing amount now, but I think it's even important just fostering that kind of mindset as well that is taught in Indigenous teachings. So just a little bit of background on this case study. It's the Umatilla River Vision and the first foods management approach developed by the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation in Oregon, US. So this comprises the Walla Walla, Cayuse, and the Umatilla tribes. And then the specific Department of Natural Resources is the one that works on the projects for restoration. And their mission puts a really emphasis on the significance of the first foods, which are culturally significant in the ceremonies and traditions of the CTUIR people, as well as for substances historically, but unfortunately this has been diminished and less accessible for them due to like the over exploitation and over harvesting by settlers. So there's four emblematic foods. So there's the fish, big game, roots, and berries. And then there's the fifth food, which is water, which you can't have, comes before and then also after all the other foods, because you can't have the rest without water. And it really emphasizes reciprocity through this first foods management. So their initial work by the Department of Natural Resources really focused on fostering the importance of the first foods in the community and just the order that it's served in. So the order is really significant because it's served in the way that the foods promise to take care of the people, and kind of it establishes that idea that we also have a responsibility to then give that care back. And then, so this also emphasizes the importance of connectivity and relationships that I discussed previously in the definitions of resilience. So then going into the next slide, we talk about the river vision, which is the application of this, and with also the integration of a scientific knowledge. So there is work or collaboration between different institutions, so universities and Fish and Wildlife agencies, with the CTUIR department to establish a scientifically based implementation roadmap for how the first foods management approach can actually be applied. So through this, they kind of developed or established 5 touchstones or components that they saw shaped and made healthy and resilient rivers. So ones that allowed and fostered the ability for rivers to cope and adapt to all these changes, and then also impact the animals that are living within them. So the first one is hydrology, so then the way in which the waters are flowing. Geomorphology, so looking more at like just the sediment composition and forms there. And then connectivity, which Emily already touched on a little bit, so that forms of floodplains and everything like that. And then riparian vegetation and aquatic animals. So all of the interactions and relationships between those 5 are really important to maintain the environmental conditions or be able to adapt and create healthy environments. So this also really emphasized the importance of process-based restoration, so that actually addresses the causes of river ecosystem degradation while also improving the processes that create and help maintain healthy ecosystems. So then on my next slide, I talk about one of the projects and first implementations of this river vision. So through this collaboration and integrating science knowledge and Indigenous knowledge, they were able to actually receive, I believe, a couple of awards for this. And so in Meacham Creek, prior to restoration, there's, in this first image, you kind of see a very straightened channel that it looks healthy in some people's mind. You might not think anything of it. But when you actually look to the second one, you would get a little bit more of diversification. But in that first one, that also caused higher temperatures during spring and summer, which impacted spawning of salmon and other animals, aquatic animals. And then it also impacted the vegetation around that. And then following restoration, by reestablishing the natural floodplain processes and really enhancing those relationships between the 5 touchstones, they were able to increase the salmonoid, lamprey, whitefish populations by reducing that water temperature again, just through that natural process establishment. And then there was also returns of the beavers to the area, which was super cool that it also connected to Emily's work there. And then also just increased native vegetation. So on the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about my takeaways. I think it's just really important to acknowledge the impact that we have had on the earth and that we're also a part of the ecosystem. I think often we take ourselves out of the ecosystem. And I think we need to really, conservation needs to find a way to kind of integrate all, it's really hard, but integrate all kind of aspects that are in play, because human health is important, but also wildlife health and ecosystem health is important. And we have a job to take care of each other. So then just in terms of applying resilience, I learned it's really complex and it's important to define how you're actually going to do that, what you're actually talking about when you're talking about resilience. And then that because of its complexity, collaboration is extremely important. And so this also requires adaptive and process-based management. So something might not work, but you can adapt to these changes as you go along. And then, so again, just acknowledging that integration of the social and ecological dimensions of sustainability, and then also encouraging the reciprocity that really fosters resilience. And then again, just some of these actions aren't always have to be large scale, and they don't always have to be huge, big projects that work on the whole ecosystem, because they can also be really small, just looking at resilience, or even in your own life, just seeing how you can support resilience, or just thinking that kind of mindfulness that comes into play when thinking about how you impact so many different things with your actions. And with that, I'll hand it off to Jer.
Yeah, hello everybody. I'm very happy to be here. Is a pleasure to be at the start of the week here, especially. I'm a person of few slides. I've only brought a couple, so hopefully my mere words can inspire some images in your mind to perhaps make up for not too many slides here. But yeah, if we could go to the first of my main slides, please. Thank you. So kind of what my work has been working with the Elbow River Watershed Partnership. And what this work has mainly been has been kind of as a bit of a preparatory sort of thing, doing a pilot podcast, which has been called Voices from the Elbow, in which that work provided quite a few fun opportunities to go on these day trips, mainly in the Bragg Creek area, but also in a couple of other places closer to Mohkinstsis, to Calgary. And this is an image from one of the bigger day trips where I think that was the largest group we've ever gone out with, kind of the main image there. And then, yeah, kind of my main work has been as a undergraduate student who was not really too involved, at least previously, in the world of rivers and water care, and more in what would be called sort of sciencey work. Rather, I'm a political philosopher mainly, I guess, which apologies in advance if I float a little too far away from the ground in saying that. But I guess kind of what my main role was, and still is, kind of what I understand that I'm doing here, is having the opportunity to kind of learn new perspectives on just things I wouldn't typically think about, such as sort of how to take care of rivers, and especially considering our first podcast, Voices from the Elbow, was mainly about flood mitigation. There were a bunch of things that I wouldn't have ever considered, just as, again, someone who's not too involved in that world. But at the same time, I think kind of then considering who I am and kind of learning a bunch of these things for the first time has been kind of valuable to figure out how to maybe, in the podcast sense, play a co-host role as well, where I'm a student who is kind of explaining the more technical jargon at times to say, well, here's some things that I never thought about and maybe that we should, or some bigger terms that maybe didn't quite come across kind of in the interviews and such for the podcast work. And yeah, it's been a great summer job so far, and kind of as we're going into the winter, I believe our main focus is to switch over, focus onto the Sutina Aquatic Habitat Restoration podcast, which I'm quite looking forward to. But kind of in the meantime, I've been on a bit of a pause. But yeah, if we could go to the next slide, please. And I guess kind of with this being said, and kind of my main focus to bring things together is that, again, kind of thinking of new ways of learning. I would never really think of water that much, despite definitely having teachings. I mean, I am Woodland Cree, and I recall kind of growing up hearing different teachings from the land mainly, although would go fishing quite regularly. And I think some more implicit things that were taught that I'm now reflecting on a little more, but in a more like explicit sense, and sort of working around water, and especially with flood mitigation, it's really made me reflect on how much sort of collaboration is needed for projects like this, which at least I typically, meaning to say that just kind of with how much care and collaboration is needed between different sort of segments of a river, considering the Elbow River, how vast it spans, in order to ensure that kind of everything kind of flows, I guess as a pun that's intended, together, that it's like, yeah, it really does require a lot of work. And if someone has a specific plan in a particular area, I mean, it requires sort of having sort of focused and deep conversations with folks to make sure that people are on the same page in terms of what everyone's doing in terms of looking after the Elbow River. And yeah, I guess for me, kind of has been this moment of I guess being a lot more sort of careful of when I'm entering conversations more generally, and in the sense that using certain words such as saying it's certainly true of this when you're talking about water care or talking about a flood, especially when floods and things like that really do affect a lot of folks. So I think kind of deeply eliciting, when I first started this work, I think I posted on Instagram saying that I'm getting paid to interview water, which is kind of a funny way to put it. But at the same time, kind of slowing down to, well, quite literally sort of record the sounds, the more foliage for the podcast. But then in thinking of that, there really is, yeah, a lot of work that goes into kind of making sure that our water is, well, safe to drink from a human perspective, but also that biodiversity is protected, and especially something even like a flood. The floods sometimes are necessary for the sense of being helpful for biodiversity, but then figuring out maybe instead of how to completely prevent, how we can maybe mitigate and have more of a sense of resiliency around these things, which I think is, I mean, at least as more for the philosophical sense, probably a good way to kind of contextualize yourself as most as you can, kind of just in the day-to-day sense, is at least kind of what I've implemented most for my time with this work. But yeah, to be honest, I think that's the most that I'll share for the moment. But I have been really grateful to do this work, and again, as someone who's kind of brand new to the world of water, and my first time working with the Elbow River Watershed Partnership, it's been a great opportunity to also kind of use my maybe unique skill set, and that I kind of had a YouTube career until I was 20 years old, and then retired, and then came to university, and thought I would never use those skills ever again. But they've come in handy here to help spread awareness about the importance of flood resilience, as well as other Elbow River sort of care related things, as well as water more broadly. But yeah, thank you everybody for listening.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Gabriella Livingstone. I just wanted to say a big thank you to Adela for asking me to speak today. It's always an honor to share some of the work that we got to do, and it was so interesting. Yeah, so my name is Gabriella Livingstone. Like I said, I'm Red River Métis, and I'm a recent graduate from the University of Calgary. I graduated in April, and I got my degree in Global Development Studies. And I've worked with the university in many different capacities, but today I wanted to talk more about the work that I co-created with a graduate student who isn't here today. Her name is Nina O'Byer. As well, I co-created with Dr. Adela Kincaid in partnership with the Alberta Institute for Wildlife Conservation. Next slide. Awesome. So like I said, the project was in partnership with the Alberta Institute for Wildlife Conservation. And what we did was we worked on analyzing the impacts of climate change on birds in order to inform future conservation actions. The Alberta Institute for Wildlife Conservation had seen a really big increase over a couple of years from 2018 to 2021 in their intakes for birds. For example, they had an increase in 70 for black-billed magpies. They had an increase of 121 for house sparrows and an increase of 63 for mallards. And we worked closely with them to form connections between AIWC's increasing intakes and the relationship between that and changing climates. The work that we did mostly was related to increasing public awareness of climate change impacts on birds. We did that through creating blog posts, which you can find on the AIWC website. We created infographics that are shared on their social media. And then we also created a website that I think Adela linked earlier that you can find on ArcGIS. Also, part of my work was like a work integrated student partnership. So I worked in person while doing this research as a baby bird caretaker, which was definitely the most unique summer job I've ever had. Basically, what I did was I was feeding birds, I was cleaning their enclosures, weighing them, and giving like daily updates to their rehabilitation staff. And this really helped me learn a lot more about what it takes to be someone that works in wildlife rehabilitation, which is a lot more work than I thought. It helped me learn a lot more about birds in general and helped me gain a better understanding of why this work is really important. If I get the next slide, please. So as we just heard from our last speaker, Jer, who had a really interesting project, watersheds are really essential for recreational, residential, agricultural, and industrial uses. But we also learned that water can be pedagogy and can act as a teacher and is home to a lot of animals, like Emily's friend, the beaver. And riparian zones, which are, I just learned this today in case no one knows this, but they're lands next to rivers, lakes, or wetlands. And they're rich in vegetation, as well as wetlands make up a big part of watersheds. And they actually support up to 80% of Alberta's wildlife and are really important travel corridors for a lot of our native bird species. And climate change and extreme weather events threaten our waterways and thus critical ecosystems for our birds. As part of our research, we explored how severe droughts posed a threat to long-term productivity and biodiversity, as waterfowl population size, nesting tendency, and clutch size are positively related to wetland numbers, meaning that the declines in the number and distribution of wetlands also reduce the number of waterfowl that are able to breed there. And then the next slide, please. Another area that we explored during this project was the impact of changing climates on invasive species. And we found that with future climates expecting to increase, we could expect invasive species to continue spreading and for native birds to continue to decline. Climate change can cause currently non-invasive species to become invasive and many native species to shift their habitats and forcing them to move to new ecosystems. While there have always been invasive species invading new territories, we have really been the culprit of speeding up this process through things like agriculture, trade, and human-driven climate change. Introduced non-native birds can cause a lot of issues for native birds, and they can cause issues for biodiversity as well because they outcompete native birds for food, resources, nests, and often invasive species don't actually have natural predators, so it makes it very easy for them to inhabit these areas. Whereas for native birds, looking for new homes is a really big challenge because in their migration, they face risks like predators, bad weather, lack of familiar foods, and having to adapt to a whole new habitat that's really unfamiliar to them. As well, their new neighbors might not be so welcoming. And then a quick example that I have here on the screen. So on the left, you can see a European starling. That's an example of an invasive species. They are highly adaptable and can withstand varying climates, which has caused many declines in birds like the one on the right, which is the northern flicker. That was in care at ERWP when I worked there, because they have very similar requirements for things like food and habitats. And then the next slide. Another topic that Nina and I looked into during this project was how changing climates also impact bird reproductive success by causing earlier laying dates that lead to mismatched timing in laying and food abundance, which is really critical to baby bird growth. So basically, because of higher spring temperatures, the birds would lay earlier, which means that they would miss the time where food abundance where there was an abundance of food. And so that becomes really difficult for them to grow. Climate change has been linked to a shorter period of available food for birds as well, which has a lot of important implications for multi-brooded species. This just means that it's a species that may lay multiple clutches in a single season. So because of this, they will not be able to produce second broods because it's shorter amount of time that food would be available to them. Higher temperatures also have a direct impact on the thermoregulation of birds, which is their ability to maintain body temperature, which affects their ability to maintain viable eggs. It is important to note, however, that while most birds do respond this way, responses to climate change are very species specific. Some birds, for example, nested later due to rising spring temperatures instead of earlier. An example of this would be mallards. However, it still had a really negative impact on their nest survival rates because they didn't have enough time for re-nesting and for duckling growth. And then the next slide, please. And this is just an image that was created by Nina, and it can be found on our website that just looks at the habitat suitability for American robins. It shows our current one from last year, 2022. And then it looks at the projected habitat suitability for them in 2070. And as we can see, it becomes a lot lower, and a lot of this is due to the changing climates in these areas. And next slide, please. So what can we do? As we can see in this graph, many of AIWC's bird admittances have been human-related causes. So the highest one there in orange we can see is window strikes, and the second highest is car collisions. And when I was caring for baby birds there, a lot of them had been brought in for reasons like cat and dog attacks. And humans also impact birds and other wildlife in many different ways, including through land use change and human-induced climate change. There are, however, many steps forward that we can take toward wildlife conservation and human-wildlife coexistence at the individual, local, and global scales. Next slide, please. So first, at the policy level, we can be advocates for our flying friends by supporting climate-focused policy changes. Some of this could be increasing urban biodiversity so they have more homes and places to eat, supporting Indigenous-led conservation, and promoting wildlife-inclusive urban design. One such example that's pictured on the right here, I have no idea how to say this, so please bear with me. It's the Khoo Phuat Hospital in Singapore. And it uses nature to support healing and prominently displays a list of the bird species that are sighted on this ground, which really helps to increase public awareness of the birds in the city. Other examples of bird-friendly urban design are things like having bird-safe windows. We can do this by putting like decals on our windows. You can get ones that like actually look like birds. And this is actually a requirement in Toronto, San Francisco, and New York. Another one is proactively designing cities with birds in mind and to expand bird habitats within the city. An example of this is the standalone bird strategy that they have adopted in Vancouver. As well, they have a bird advisory committee that provides a list of actions and recommendations on how to make our cities more bird safe. And the last example I have on the slide is actually in Edmonton. They do a really great job of understanding the physical barriers for birds to get around. And how this might prevent them from moving around the city safely. And so they look at how they can design better pathways so that we can become better neighbors with our birds. Next slide. And these are some individual actions that we can take, like making our windows bird friendly, like I said, choosing shade-grown coffee instead of full sun-grown coffee. That would reduce deforestation impacts. Decreasing light pollution, keeping our pets leashed when we can, and more broadly, just learning to explore the outdoors more responsibly. And next slide. And some of my key takeaways from this project. This project, like I said, was very unique for me. I learned that anyone can really have an impact in creating a more sustainable future. As an art student, when I was offered this role, I felt very hesitant because in my mind, sustainability, especially in the context of wildlife rehabilitation, was something that was definitely more isolated towards the science field. And I felt a little bit out of my depth. I was working with a lot of zoology and biology students, and this was the first time I'd really been in a role like this. But what this work really taught me and what the birds taught me is that sustainability is such a complex issue. It affects so many facets of our life. And so I think it can really benefit from an interdisciplinary approach. And I think that's everything for me. I have some references on the slide, and you can also reach out to me by email if you have any questions.
Wonderful. Yeah, I love seeing all the hand claps and the hearts coming in as everyone was presenting. So I love seeing it again. I just wanted to say a huge thank you to all our speakers. It's just really impressive and really incredible important work you're doing. We had a few questions come in, so I'm just going to ask one for the roundtable, if that's okay with everyone, and then we could just move into the Q&A from the audience because I know they're eager to engage with you. I know each of you shared kind of things already that you're most excited about, so I guess I would ask, are there any specific lessons you're going to be taking away with you to future opportunities? Or just daily life, I guess, can make it really open.
I guess I could share, I think not from my own presentation, but from listening to the other presenters, I think I definitely learned we can learn so much from the land and from our more than human friends. I was reading recently about how we can really understand climate change by looking at birds. They're such big indicators. And I think so looking at like animal behaviors and things like that, I think that's a really big thing that I'm going to be taking away and understanding how I can learn from wildlife and from our land. Yeah.
I could share as well. I think for me as a science student, I always had a very Western science approach to a lot of the work that I was doing. And after doing this research and getting some more knowledge from Adela and everybody else that I've worked with, I think that I will approach my work in future with a more holistic approach to things. So that's definitely something that I'll be taking away from this.
Yeah, I think mine is also kind of the same, just really that importance of collaboration and then also learning from other people from completely different backgrounds is so important because they might have a completely new perspective on what you were an expert on that you never even thought of. And it's just, yeah, just the importance of collaboration with a bunch of different people in any kind of work is really important, but especially in conservation and sustainability. And then also just the idea of learning from wildlife. I think I also just had the idea of me helping wildlife, but then they also helped me so much throughout the years that I've been able to work with them. So really just taking away those lessons.
Just kind of echoing, but yeah, I think just kind of in shaping your own understanding of how you move throughout the world to, well, maybe think that things are a little less disconnected than they might seem at times, as a Pan-Indigenous would saying at the moment that's pretty well known would say is all my relations, and I think that's kind of an important thing to keep in mind no matter where you're moving. Yeah, paying attention to that there's learning opportunities kind of all around you always.
Thank you, everyone. If I could add my thoughts to this from an educator perspective, I think some of the takeaways from working with this exciting and excellent panel of students here was the importance of relationships with not-for-profits, with community, and with others. I think as you have heard from many of the presentation, the importance of those, building those relationships, also with students, with the animals, with the land as well, that's key. And then also giving yourself enough time. So perhaps if there are some of you in the audience who are educators and thinking about doing this kind of work, or if you do this type of work, having enough time to make those connections and to bring funding, grants, the partnerships, bringing all of those pieces together, it can be a lot. And so that's another piece. And then my third, which I thought of, was supporting student opportunities as well, and kind of seeking them out and getting to know students and what their interests are and where and how they would like to contribute to some of this work. So I think those were my three takeaways.
Thanks so much, everyone. So I'm going to move into Q&A with participants, and we have a question here that I believe is for Sadie. Why did the socioeconomic factors of human health affect the future collaboration of adaptations in our ecosystems?
So for the socioeconomic factors, are we thinking of like how we impact the world to support ourselves, or is that might just need a little bit of clarification for that one?
Yeah, maybe we could lean in with your first kind of interpretation. I don't have more.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I guess so.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess for like how we have impacted ecosystems is often through simplification. So what that means is that we've reduced diversity, or say like taking over wildlands to grow crops instead. That really simplifies an ecosystem and takes away that diversity that is really needed to help cope with random changes that come. So having diversity means that you have a bunch of different functions available, and maybe there's also some robustness, so functional redundancy, where you have some species that fill kind of the same niche. So when you have all these different things and diversity there, they can all kind of, if one goes, unfortunately, there's kind of this way that it can be fulfilled by another organism, or a way that that essential function is still maintained, and that other like relationships are built through that process, if that makes sense. So really just looking at how we as humans impact nature. So a really good example of like a way that like harvesting could be supportive of resilience rather than negative, and still support our needs as humans, because we're a growing population. So they're in the C2UIR, their first foods management approach, they really emphasize like traditional harvesting practices. So for berries, that meant leaving some berries on the bush, never harvesting at all. So that means that there was berries left for bears or other animals to come by and eat, and also for that to encourage berry production in the future. So that's further encouraging like the continuity of a healthy ecosystem.
Yeah, thank you, Sadie. That's super helpful. Just seeing that Sherry asked a question and she just put a comment in the chat too. Impacts from our individual relationships with this and harvesting in this project. You make us aware of the healthy future, and thanks for your feedback and answer, Sadie. So thanks, Sadie.
No problem. I'm glad it answered your question.
Yeah, we have another question here. Do you have data on the impacts of things like bridges and windmills on bird populations, or pesticides and herbicides?
For my work specifically, no, we didn't do any work on like infrastructure like that. I do think that that would be super interesting to look into in the future, and I'm sure it has a very big impact on bird species, especially in terms of, I'm assuming, migratory species and how that impacts in their flight paths and things like that. But no, not really in that sense.
Thanks for sharing, Gabriella. And Emily, it looks like this question is for you. What is the success rate of beavers when they're relocated?
This is
Sorry.
a really great question,
Yeah.
because I don't think that there is enough research on it. It would probably be my next area of interest moving forward from the work that we've already done. I know that when we released our beaver back into the wild from AWIC, we really weren't sure what his success rate was going to look like, if he was going to struggle integrating into a new community and whatnot. So I think that it would be a really interesting project to look into. But I also think that it comes with a lot of risks in terms of ethics and protocol, just because we don't want to disrupt wildlife, and we want to make sure that we're carrying out those kinds of research strategies properly. But I do think it could really inform us a lot about sustainability, and if rehoming these beavers could be beneficial from a holistic standpoint. I think that's a good question. And my answer is I don't really have an answer at the moment.
No, thanks for sharing. It sounds like more research is needed. And I know you had another question come in, Emily. So if you don't mind me asking it again, and then you could tell the whole audience. How do beaver dams that are filled up with silt affect the trout in the stream?
Yeah, so I did type up an answer for this one, but I can summarize that. So my work specifically looked mostly at how beaver dams are mitigating the impacts of climate change in the waterways. So I don't have a ton of information on how they would impact fish specifically, but I did attend a talk with Dr. Jordan Kennedy, who's really well versed on this. She does a lot of field research, and she's also an engineer, so she has looked into this extensively. And what she explained to me is that as dams age, there's more there's more channels within the dams that make it more accessible for fish to travel through. So I think in summary, dams are more beneficial as they age. From the research that I've looked into, most of the positive impacts of dams don't come initially, they come through intergenerational beaver families.
Okay, thanks, Emily. Thanks for answering twice. I appreciate it. Everyone got to hear it this time. And I think Adela has a question.
I do, and this might be for both Emily and Jer. I'd love to know your thoughts on the connectivity of beavers and floods and drought and what that relationship might look like. Jer, I know we listened to that podcast together and I can't remember. I think that might have been part of it. So if you can maybe comment a little bit about some of those relationships, and Emily, you might have something to add to this as well in terms of the beaver part.
Well, I think if I can add a little bit on the beavers, something that I found helpful to think of recently, but with the idea of sort of flood resilience rather than maybe complete resistance, like sometimes floods, again, can be helpful and are kind of necessary. So in the same sense, I think that a lot of the times as beavers do get a bad rap, that's sort of where I see the parallel to be like, well, maybe we should adjust understandings at times to rather than completely resist, rather switch to more of a resilient sort of way of thinking. And then for floods, more specifically between sort of droughts and flood mitigation, I mean, sort of considering that you would think they're exact opposites of each other in the sense of droughts being all the water's gone and floods being there's too much water. A lot of the sort of approaches generally are around sort of water basins and sort of dams and things like that sometimes are used as like a catch-all to hopefully be able to, in the case of a flood, sort of empty out reservoir water. But a lot of the times, or well, seemingly, it's not quite as simple as is very little. So yeah, kind of, I guess at least a takeaway for me, again, in a more general sense, is maybe when you think you have a catch-all answer, sometimes you have to reflect a little more and get more thoughts and opinions. But
thank you, Jer.
And just to add to what Jer is speaking of, I think that there's definitely some benefits to floods, etc. But I think for me, from the climate change standpoint, we're experiencing more floods and more droughts than maybe is what's beneficial for the ecosystem. So I think that having this tool that these beavers are creating these dams that are so beneficial to the environment and really help mitigate these impacts is something worth looking into and supporting.
Thank you, Emily. I appreciate that. Yeah, something that I learned from Dr. Kennedy and going to the talks was the relationship that beavers have. So when there are floods, you know, they create the capacity to capture and gather the water. And in times of drought, they also create wetlands and the water to be on the land, even though there is that drought. So I found all those intersections really interesting. So thank you both for speaking to that.
Thank you. We got lots of questions coming in, so I'll just start at the top. I've noticed a sharp decrease in the number of waterfowl and songbirds in our area. Have there been any studies done to determine if avian flu is responsible?
I think in terms of this, I don't have specific data because my project didn't really touch on that. I know the city of Calgary did release some data on this, especially in terms of like avian flu in terms of wild bird species. I think that was back in 2022 when this research was being done. I know so many birds have been moved out of Calgary recently, and we've seen such a dramatic increase in a lot of like sparrows and stuff, like invasive species. And that's been a really big topic in Calgary specifically. I'm not sure if that causes the decline. I'm sure maybe it's a bit of both. Maybe it's a complex problem. But yeah, I can't say for sure because I don't have specific data.
That's really helpful. Thanks. Next question, whoever wants to address this, how can we stop further environmental damage from occurring as approved by municipalities? So their concern is about the policies that allow building things too close to the river. So I guess it's kind of asking like how we can support policy change, if anyone has any thoughts on that.
That's a tough one too, I think, and I don't know if we have any answers for that. I do know that Dr. Kennedy also spoke about this, and to, for planners to consider building around or with beavers and what that looks like and how that lands, how that looks. So that gave me pause and something to think about as well. We can maybe dig that up. So if the person who asked the question wants to connect on some of that work, I can reach out and get a more information or a better answer for them from that perspective. I don't know, Jer, if you recall. I know that was also, you might want to listen to the podcast that Jer put together, because I think there might be some additional thoughts on that in the podcast that were created there.
I believe there is. And to encourage people to listen, I'll add no more.
Okay, thanks, Adele and Jer. The next question is for each student. Was there a particular day, event, or activity that stands out as meaningful to you this summer?
I can go. I think for me, one of the most meaningful days this summer was when we actually got to release our beaver back out into the wild. We'd cared for him for almost a year and a half, right from the time that he was just an orphaned baby. So we definitely had Sadie and I had a really close relationship with him. I think it was bittersweet, but it was definitely a very memorable day.
Yeah, I think just adding on to that, because me and Emily did work closely together, the beaver happened to be like one of the most impactful patients that I was able to work with at the rehab. I had worked there for several years and volunteered there for several years, and it just was a completely different relationship than the other animals I'd worked with, because they actually need that bond with their caregiver to actually be able to develop those social skills and just also get through being in a rehab by themselves. So that was really different than working with, like, say, a bird that you quickly take out, medicate, and then put back into its cage. So it was just a completely way for me to see that relationship with the wildlife, and really just, even though I love birds, I love working with them. And I think that relationship with the beaver also made me see my relationship with the birds and how I can learn from them as well. Because they all have individual personalities. The more you learn about them, the more you work with them. So I think just, yeah, that was probably my most impactful.
I think kind of going off that, for me, it was not really a specific day, more so just the event of getting to see this side of sustainability and learning about wildlife rehabilitation and what that looks like. I think it's such a emotionally and physically demanding job, and there's so much that goes into it that I had no idea, and it really gave me a new sense of appreciation for the work that people do, not only at AWIC but other sustainability jobs as well. I just had a really great summer. It was so much fun getting to work with birds. Didn't know anything about them going into it. And I keep telling people, like, birding sneaks up on you. I am a big birder now. I recently went on a backpacking trip, and everywhere I was like, oh man, I know that bird. And just spewing facts about birds now. So yeah, just a newfound appreciation for wildlife, I think, on my end.
Yeah, just to quickly add on to that, I also was terrified of birds before starting working at AWIC. So, and now I'm absolutely obsessed with them and try to identify every single thing. So yeah, it just really fosters your like love for nature and like wanting to care for it.
I think for me, just for a favorite day, we had made a trip down to Kainai the Blood Tribe for a summit. It's called their KEPA Summit. I believe it stands for Kainai Ecosystem Protection Association. And it was a 3-day conference where just due to scheduling was only there for the first day, but kind of hearing a lot of perspectives. It was kind of more broad beyond just water as well. But yeah, I think kind of it was my first time being down south there. Yeah, it was a great time, and I would recommend to if there's any other undergraduate students, that there's a lot of opportunities that maybe if you think there wouldn't be something like a connection for you to do something like doing a lot of trips out about for things that are typically not related, that there might be. So always keep your eyes and ears open, I suppose.
Thank you, everyone. That was a great question. Emily, this one's for you. I know beavers love to build dams and are an important part of the ecosystem. What is our friend the beavers go to, trees or bark, when building dams?
Yeah, I was reading this over. So most of my work was specifically looking at water, so I'm not totally sure about the impact removing the trees have on the ecosystem. I think the best answer I could give for this is that in my research, I was finding a lot of it showed that the way their dams retain water really encourages a lot of biodiversity in the riparian zone, which is the areas on either side of the water. So I would think, I don't know for sure, but I would think that they're able to encourage enough biodiversity that it would make up for the removal of the trees. But that would be something I'd have to look into more.
For our specific beaver as well, just in terms of like bark or trees, he did strip all the bark. He would always leave these bare sticks in his enclosure, and he really liked poplar, aspen, or willow. Those were his favorites. So just specific to him. Could be different for other guys, but
I like that answer. Thanks. Another question here. Is there any funding available for farmers to encourage the use of pond levelers rather than trapping or blowing up their dams?
I think maybe that's a question for me, and my answer is that I'm really not sure. I hope there's funding available, but I don't have an answer for that one. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, I'm gonna flag that one. Can look into. But it seems like a lot of people love the beaver, so that's great.
Can I jump in, Alana? Dawn, can I?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Gabby, I just wanted to follow up on something you had mentioned previously. Could you share with everyone? I found this extremely fascinating. Could you share with everyone the feeding of the mealworms and what that process looked like, as well as how frequent the feedings were to take care of the birds? And then maybe Sadie and Emily, you could comment on the care of the beaver and what that looked like.
Yeah, for sure. So pretty much when you feed the animals, it depends on kind of the age. A lot of the baby birds had to be fed mealworms. And it depends again on the age, but some of them needed them to be drowned in water. And then you have to squish the heads. Very gross. And then you use tweezers to feed them. And you pretty much just put the tweezers in their mouth. They do a lot of it themselves. It's not that hard. That was very interesting. I had no idea that there was so much that went into the types of food. When they're when they're older, they can eat kind of a more variety of foods. Like they'll eat a lot of fruits and veggies, and then you add some meats as well. In terms of like how frequently they needed to be fed, it was a lot. The baby birds depends on the age again, but between 10 to 30 minutes each. And I was caring for like 1.5 rooms of them. So it was like every 2 minutes a timer was going off, and it was very stressful to make sure I was feeding the right ones. And it's a lot of like trying to, because you have to do like your daily updates with the staff as well, and that was also kind of difficult to know what foods they're liking, what foods they're not liking, since you had so many. So I think it's important to like make a relationship in whatever way that you can in that capacity, because you can't be too attached with the birds, so that you can remember which one's which and stuff like that. But it was a lot of work. It was a lot more work than I had expected. I didn't know baby birds ate that much food and that frequently. So yeah.
I'll actually let Sadie talk a little bit about the beaver's care when he was a bit younger, because I think she worked really closely with him at that age.
Yeah, so when he first came in, we had to cuddle him, make sure he was getting enough attention, because otherwise they can get really sad, and unfortunately that often causes them not to make it. So he really needs to initially make that bond with the caregiver. This year with this guy was a little bit different because there was, I think, 4 main caregivers, including myself. So we were, usually you just kind of have one caregiver that can establish that bond. So it's also minimizing how much of how like habituated they're getting and stuff. But we were able to do it with 4 and still create that bond and still minimize our impact on him. And he ended up also becoming a little bit independent earlier than other beavers. So we were able to release him even earlier than we typically do. But when he was really young, involved with cuddling him, making sure you're getting enough time, doing pool changes every single day, because they get gross very quickly, making sure it's not too wet, not too gross in there. And then also he would get a specific formula, which would often, he would need it a certain way, certain temperature to be able to actually take it, because he's very finicky again, and you need a certain process to be able to go through that. And it's a very specific thing in wildlife rehab too, where you have to have designated caregivers so that you're not having people come in, and it still needs to be very specific and kind of like it's very strict, the protocol on who's working with the beaver and who's not. But yeah, so that was the main work, was just feeding him. And then as he got older, it was getting out browse every single day. So going down the street or the road by the clinic and cutting down bushes for him, making sure they're nice and good. And then, yeah.
Thanks, everyone. I know we're getting close to 6, but we had another question come in from audience member we haven't heard from, so I thought this might be a nice one. We could do some concluding thoughts on, or if people are able to stay longer after 6, we can also stay, totally up to everyone's time. But these talks have been really valuable for understanding the importance of incorporating Indigenous worldviews into research, conservation practice, and management processes. I was wondering if anyone had any views about how education systems, like at an early age, maybe K to 12, can help shape more sustainable mindsets.
One program that I recently learned about through my research was there's a lot of programs with birding for young students. I think it's called the Schoolyard Bird Blitz. I don't know for sure. I think that's what it's called. And basically, students are asked to go out in their schoolyards and take photos and document what kind of birds they think they are. And you submit it online, and then it helps researchers track birds. And I think that's a really good way to encourage younger students to get involved and start those conversations and understand maybe why birds are moving out of those habitats, why different birds are coming in, and things like that. But yeah, I don't know if anyone else has any thoughts on that as well.
For specific programs and that sort of thing, I'm not entirely sure, but I think at least the way from my kind of Woodland Cree perspective, would like to see more of, kind of perhaps would be better in earlier education as well, is to kind of think about how sort of social cohesion works in like a human sense, which a lot of the times is kind of mimicking and copying each other, which from a lot of for most Indigenous perspectives, we just kind of turn that gaze to paying attention to our non-human friends as well, to see, well, how do they live, and then kind of taking their views into consideration with how maybe we should at times.
And maybe if I could quickly, I know we have a minute here, just reiterate what you had shared previously. So getting involved with various events in Indigenous communities, such as KIPA, the one that we attended this summer and others that take place throughout, I think is another way to maybe answer this question that's hopefully helpful to you.
Sorry, I'm having trouble keeping up with the chat and the Q&A, which is like really awesome that everyone's like so engaged right now with all the questions. It's really lovely to see. We really appreciated everyone's questions. I think I will wrap it up because it is 6 o'clock and people I know are very busy and probably have other things to go to do. But is there any like, do you want to do like a final roundtable amongst all the speakers? Just like any final thoughts you want to leave participants with?
I think if I could start this one, if anyone's interested, please get in touch. I see Gabriella had shared experiential learning is so valuable for students. I think it's also valuable for various organizations, I think for education as well. So if this has given you any ideas for potential partnerships, then that's wonderful. If you'd like to reach out to any of us or to myself, I'd be very appreciative of that. And I appreciate all of your time and thank you for joining us.
I think for myself, I would just like to thank Adela and all the other partnerships that I had the opportunity to work with, and really just encourage any students who are passionate about wildlife and sustainability to get involved in any way that they can. I think it's a really rewarding opportunity.
Hey, thanks everyone. For those who are still with us, Calgary, we're actually going to be launching our institutional sustainability report tomorrow. So unofficially announcing it today, but it'll be out tomorrow with a video to see all the great things Calgary have been doing for sustainability this past year. We have a short survey if you want to click on the QR code, because we'd love to get your feedback on other initiatives you'd like to see happening at Calgary. But I just want to say big heartfelt thank you to all the presenters today. It was really informative. I really enjoyed your presentations. Thank you to Cody behind the scenes who's been sharing the slides from City of Calgary. Yeah, thank you all for spending your Monday evening with us. We really appreciate it.
And thank you, Alana Dawn.